A miracle of modern missions. The story of Matula, a Congo convert.
God our Father, full of kindness, look upon our country, every land which sin has cursed and where deep darkness still remains. God our Father, full of kindness, look upon our country.
By John Bell, Baptist missionary. Originally published in 1900, revised for easier readability in 2025, but not abridged. Audiobook produced by scrollreader.com. Introductory Note by J.B. Wathen, Secretary of the Baptist Missionary Society. Not long before he died, Alfred Saker, one of Africa's earliest missionaries, wrote that nothing brings a missionary more joy or strength than seeing God's grace at work in the lives of the people he serves. He called these miracles of missions, old ways passing away and everything becoming new, and found in them proof that God's promise never fails. My word will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. The story of Matula, told here by Mr. Bell from Wathen Station on the Lower Congo River, is another remarkable example of the gospel's power to transform even the most broken and uneducated lives. Few accounts in modern missions are as moving and inspiring as the work among the Congo's formerly cannibal tribes over the past 24 years. Their dramatic turn to faith makes a strong case for sending the lamp of life into every dark corner of Central Africa. Matula stayed true to his Savior even under the harshest persecution. He trusted God completely when he faced certain death at the hands of powerful enemies, never doubting that his Father in heaven was in control. He showed no fear, despite the spite and treachery of those who hunted him. We can thank God that his grace shone so clearly in Matula's life. Today, his bold witness has changed his hometown of Mongo. A prayer house now stands there. Chief Lonenga has been baptized, and 60 to 70 children attend school taught by a local Christian teacher. Few mission fields have seen local believers lead such wide outreach as the Congo mission. From the start, every church member has taken on a personal share of service. At Wathen Station, the native church supports 15 local evangelists. 44 outstations are visited by native workers. Schools have 1,507 day students and 807 Sunday students, and 15 people form the Wathen Temperance Society. All costs for this evangelistic and educational work are covered by the native Christians themselves. Mr. Bell's sympathetic portrait of Matula will surely fuel more missionary passion. It may inspire many young men to dedicate their lives to bringing Africa to Christ. To most readers, it may seem I've become overly enthusiastic about the life of a simple Congolese man. Yet we should value truth, sincerity, and honesty wherever they appear, remembering that God made all nations from one family, and we are all his children. Africans have rightly been judged harshly for habits of submission, cunning, and cruelty. But when in such a setting we find an African gentleman despised by his peers for his honesty, sincerity, and kindness, and know he represents many more, we owe it to him to give thanks to God and be encouraged. The tale of Matula's remarkable escape was told across England, Ireland, and America by the Reverend R.H.C. Graham of San Salvador during his furloughs in 1898 and 1899. Many urged him to publish it as a pamphlet. He hoped it would fit into Mr. Bentley's then-in-progress Pioneering on the Congo, but Bentley ultimately could not make room for it. I, too, had intended to write Matula's story after his return to Ngombe. Soon afterward I went home on furlough, and other duties filled my time until I nearly forgot. In 1901, I met Matula traveling to the station. He looked frail. We feared sleep sickness, and we thought he might not live long, taking his story with him. I arranged to meet him and his wife the next morning and over the following days, and from their accounts I gathered the key facts of his life. When I told Mr. Graham about my plan, he kindly urged me to go ahead and succeed, and he sent the full report of Matula's trial, which he witnessed himself. I am deeply grateful to him. I'm sure everyone who heard parts of Matula's story from Mr. Graham or me during deputation will welcome this brief yet complete account of his life. This little book is dedicated to all who have shared, even in the smallest way, in bringing the gospel to the dark land of the Congo. Chapter 1. Without Hope. Before 1871, no one really knew what lay deep inside the Congo. People thought it could never be explored because the forests, rivers, and swamps were so hard to cross. Many tried and failed, and for years the heart of Africa remained a blank spot on the map. Then Henry Stanley made his daring journey. He started at Zanzibar on the east coast, traveled across the continent, and finally reached the mouth of the Congo River on the west coast. His trip let the world see the land's rivers, forests, and mountains, and meet some of the people who lived there. Yet most of their story stayed hidden, and for the most part still is. Still, we can notice some general things about the Congo peoples. All their dialects share a simple, clear structure, and they nearly use the same word for God. Long ago, their ancestors built huts, made spears, forged hoes, and farmed the land with skill and care. Over time, however, they stopped inventing new tools or ideas. They copied old ways without creating anything new. Action and thought feed each other. But when people turn away from what is good and give in to their lowest desires, their minds grow dull. They find it hard even to imagine pure thoughts, let alone live by them. As the Bible says, when people are given over to vile passions, they ignore God's creation and focus only on themselves. We don't know exactly when or how the Congo peoples lost the light they once had, but the darkness closed in because they refused to acknowledge God. In their present state, these people know God's name, but are so bound by superstition that anyone who speaks of him is called a sorcerer. They refuse to listen about God, and mentioning him marks you as a witch. Expecting widespread progress among them is useless. Yet occasionally in such a setting, you meet someone utterly different from those around him. He lives in that world but rises above it. For him, we must accept a simple truth. Even in the darkest places and among the most degraded, God always leaves a witness. That person often doesn't understand his own conflict. He joins the crowd watching horrors that his whole being rejects, while others cheer murder. At times he may take part in their wild rites, but he is never happy and hides his feelings, knowing they will be misunderstood. The people call him a witch and feel uneasy around him, though they can't say why. He has no clear light to guide him and doesn't know where to find it. Many such souls have lived and died in the Congo through the ages. Their quiet resistance held back total evil, but only just. Matula was one of these, until the gospel came. Without the work of Christian missionaries, he would have lived and died, hated by his peers and misunderstood by his friends, simply because his gentle, humble nature clashed with everything around him. Much of this may seem exaggerated or hard to believe, but it helps to remember how simple and how trusting the average Congo native can be. He dreams often and believes his dreams are real. He echoes Tennyson's line, "Dreams are true while they last," and adds, "And we must take revenge for our dreams." I wouldn't be surprised if many people in the Congo have been murdered because someone, convinced by a dream, believed their enemy had done them harm there. To them, a dream is as real as any waking event. They live surrounded by powerful superstitions. A rustling leaf might be a spirit moving nearby, and anything unusual is blamed on witchcraft. Anyone who shines at a craft or excels in trade is suspected of having a spirit's help and might be killed to stop future harm. They believe deeply in fate and feel powerless to avoid disaster. A person accused of witchcraft usually accepts the challenge to prove their innocence, certain they will pass the test. If they fail, the community feels justified in punishing them. They think a stranger can't bewitch them, so when illness or death strikes, they search only among the victim's own people for a witch. Every sickness, every death, is blamed on sorcery. In hunting or fighting, they believe no one can be harmed, or no animal taken, unless they first honor their fetish. Even in war, if a warrior falls, they say he was hit by the enemy's fetish, but actually killed by a witch among his own side. In almost every part of life, people feel controlled either by fetishism or by witchcraft, sometimes both at once. For instance, if a disease won't yield to a fetish's power, they turn to witchcraft, or in war they may use both methods together. Families are also defined very broadly. All members of a clan, or even everyone from the same town, call each other brothers and sisters. A mother's brothers and sisters are all called mothers, and a father's brothers and sisters are all fathers. With so many mothers and fathers, it can be nearly impossible to tell who someone's real parents are, and so children end up with many mothers and many fathers. This book isn't meant to explain all the customs and beliefs of the Congolese people. I mention them only when they help tell Matula's story. My goal is simply to share the life of one of our kindest and most devoted native Christians. I hope readers will trust its truth and thank God, who wonderfully guided and protected Matula in his darkest times. Chapter 2. Birth of Matula. For ages the Congo lay in darkness, so dark that no one knew when it began. After a long pitch-black stretch, people on the coast shouted, "The dawn is here! The dawn is here!" They meant the first missionaries from Rome had arrived to share Christianity. But their visit was like a single flash of lightning in a stormy sky, brief and leaving no real light. That true dawn would not come for nearly 200 more years. By then, the people had fallen into the lowest level of cruelty and chaos one can imagine. There was no law or order. The strong enslaved the weak, even selling their former masters. Bands of raiders captured anyone traveling alone and sold them as slaves. Would-be rulers filled their towns with stolen people. No one could seek help or justice. Everyone lived in fear. Yet even in that disorder, a few crafts survived. Blacksmiths still worked iron, and potters shaped clay into pots. When Europeans settled on the coast hundreds of years earlier, they brought new tools and goods. Those items reached the interior by trading hands. The Congolese people, skilled at copying, made rough versions of what they saw, simple clothes, basic wooden furniture, doing their best to carry on these trades despite the darkness around them. They couldn't make guns themselves, so they bought them at very high prices. The farther inland you went, the fewer you saw. Many blacksmiths did a good business making bullets and slugs for hunting and war. People knew how to work iron well, even though they didn't mine it deeply. When one spot's surface ore ran out, they simply moved on to a richer one. About 20 years before Cumber and Hartland arrived at Mbanza-Makuta in 1880, there was a town nearby called Mongo. It was founded by 4 brothers, Nimu and his siblings, who were skilled smiths. They were prosperous and owned many slaves. Supplying bullets and slugs across the countryside made them wealthy, but as they had to go farther for ore, they decided to settle on a prime site and named it Mongo. Nimu, the eldest, became chief, and a harsh one at that. He feared any nephew might grow up to challenge him. Whenever one of his brothers had a baby, he demanded to know its sex. If it was a boy, he killed the child with a blow to the head. Girls, however, increased his wealth. Their future husbands paid a high bride price, often right after birth. His brothers could not stand his cruelty forever. They each built their own towns. One brother, Mpanzu, founded Nsamba just a short distance away. But Nimu kept tormenting them, so they plotted to remove him. On a market day, they accused him of witchcraft and forced him to drink poison. As he weakened, they clubbed him to death and looted all his possessions. About the time Nimu was killed, another blacksmith named Niku settled a little south of Mongo. He brought his favorite young wife, Mondele, a name borrowed from the word for white man, since cloth first came from Europeans, along with their slaves and belongings. They'd come from a district over 60 miles to the southeast. Niku was well known for the anklets, bracelets, and necklets he forged, and he often traveled far to sell them. He found a great market in the Makuta area, where he also smelted iron ore. There he struck up a strong friendship with Mpanzu of Nsamba. On returning from one profitable trip, Niku discovered his household nearly starving. So he decided to move closer to Mpanzu, hoping for better security and trade. His wife and the other women were uneasy. If anything happened to Niku among strangers, they feared being sold as slaves. but the promise of a safer, more prosperous life won them over. They built their new home about an hour or two south of Mongo, not far from Nsamba. Mpanzu was delighted to have his friend so close. To the north ruled Lunyanga, the proud and cruel chief of Nkondo. He was known to execute anyone who offended him, even slightly. As Niku's fame and skill spread, Lunyanga grew jealous and looked for a reason to strike. His harsh rule soon drew the ire of neighboring chiefs, who fined him slaves and a large sum of shell money for mistreating his people. Unwilling to pay, Lunyanga devised a darker plan. He would kill Niku and seize his wealth to cover the fine. He whispered his scheme to his own slaves, promising them rich rewards, and they eagerly agreed, for they had joined him on such raids before. They planned to strike that very night, so word wouldn't spread. As soon as darkness fell, Lunyanga's men, guns loaded, ammunition ready, slipped past Mongo and Nsamba and crept into Kinzembo, where Niku's village lay in deep sleep. They surrounded the chief's compound, posted lookouts by every exit, and then, at a signal, opened fire into the huts. The men who rushed out were shot. The women and girls were seized as captives. In barely an hour they looted everything of value and marched their prisoners back to Nkondo, arriving before dawn. By morning, the massacre was known everywhere, yet no one dared seek justice. Many even celebrated. "This land is ours," they proclaimed, and Lunyanga's pride and power grew. Those who had fined him earlier lost the courage to demand their payment. Mpanzu grieved for Niku, but had no means to punish Lunyanga. To protect Niku's beloved young wife, Mundele, from slavery at strange hands, he bought her freedom and married her himself. He treated her with deep affection and stored all his precious goods in her home, a high mark of his esteem. As a wealthy trader wanting an heir of his own blood, Mpanzu prized Mundele above his other wives, since children born to free women belonged to their mother's family. Only a son by Mundele would carry on Mpanzu's name and inheritance. Mundele and Mpanzu soon had a child, but it died very young. They were heartbroken. When another baby came, it also died. Mpanzu mourned deeply, but Mundele suffered even more. She accused him of casting spells on their children. She could not forget that she had once been free and respected among women. Now she was a slave, her first husband dead, her babies gone. The grief nearly drove her mad. One day her friends noticed she was missing. After searching, they found her in the woods, lying in a small pool of blood. She was almost unconscious. They carried her home, and after several days she recovered. In her despair, she had cut her own throat to end her life. Poor Mundele knew nothing of why people suffer or where comfort comes from. She only knew God's name, and she called on it again and again, crying, "Nzambi ovanga kansi kazeye vanga ko." God creates, but he does not know how to create. Her heart was dark with pain, and she did not realize that God hears and answers even the most anguished cries. Yet in truth, her desperate prayer looked for a dawn after that long night of sorrow. And God did answer. Her husband's family and even she herself thought her outburst was pagan superstition, but before long she gave birth to a daughter who lived. Soon after came a son, whom they named Matula. Brighter days had arrived. In time she bore 7 healthy children, an almost unheard of blessing in the Congo. She would live to see the light of a new day for her land, and 4 or 5 of her children would grow up to be earnest, faithful Christians. Chapter 3. Childhood of Matula. Childhood in the Congo can seem full of freedom, but it is often harsh and lonely. From dawn to dusk, children roam outdoors, chasing insects or whatever catches their eye, with nobody to call them home or tell them to go to bed. Even before they can crawl, a Congo baby is tied to its mother's back each morning and carried into the fields. The infant's first view is the load balanced on her head, sometimes baskets of vegetables, a bundle of firewood, or a heavy pot of water. As the child grows, it learns to carry awkward loads on its own head, since no one in the Congo would carry on their arm what they can hold on their head. Once in the garden, the little one is set down under a bush while the mother hoes the earth. If the baby cries, she stops to nurse it. Then either the child falls asleep or she straps it back onto her back, where it finds a cradle of safety. Soon it begins to crawl, exploring and sampling whatever it can reach, fruits, leaves, insects, learning by trial which things are safe to eat. The mother only intervenes when the child touches a poisonous plant. As they grow, children chase caterpillars, frogs, and rats, and in doing so they learn for themselves which creatures make good food. They also pick up practical knowledge of plants, which ones feed them, which heal, and which harm. Girls stay with their mothers, learning to weed, hoe, sow, plant, and cook all the way into young womanhood. Boys spend only the first 4 or 5 years by their mother's side. After that, they must look after themselves. When a boy is old enough, he joins the older boys in the woods all day. No school, no punishments, just freedom unless they start a fight. Then the village holds a palaver to sort out who was wrong. As they wander, they watch ants, squirrels, monkeys, and track antelope through the undergrowth. Their favorite pastime is rat hunting, and when they bring home a good catch, their mother has no trouble serving meat with their cassava pudding. When a boy reaches about 8 years old, he may build a small hut for himself or go live with some older boys. By that age, he feels too grown up to stay close to his mother, except perhaps when he's hungry. Around this time, he begins wearing a cloth, and the men of the village may start to notice him. They might take him on trading trips and use him for heavy work, though they give him a small payment. Some of my younger readers might think, what a fun life those Congo boys must have. No one to call them, no one to bother them, no one to punish them. Wouldn't it be great to live like that for a while? Yes, perhaps it would, for a short time. But when I felt very lonely, I would want someone to keep me in check. When I was tired and weary of always having my own way, I would want someone to care enough to bother with me. And when I did something I knew was very wrong, I would want someone to correct me, because that would bring peace to my conscience. It's sad how quickly these children grow tired of wandering. It gives them no purpose. Soon they are left standing around the village, looking dull and alone, with no one to guide them and nothing to interest them. When they fall sick, there is no one to help, because, poor little ones, no one knows how to care for the sick or give proper treatment. If a child becomes ill, a local healer might be called. He will rub his hand over the child's body and say some words. But when the illness becomes serious, there is no one to cool the hot forehead, no one to moisten dry lips, no one to sing a gentle song to comfort the child. Drums may be beaten, and traditional dances may begin, but these only disturb the suffering child. As the fever rises, the child's covering may be taken off, and the dancers become louder, dancing, shouting, and calling out, until the little one may pass away, killed by exposure and cold, not from cruelty, but from a deep, dark ignorance. Those who grow up in the Congo really live by survival of the fittest. It was in that setting that Matula was born and raised. His childhood was much like what I have already described for any boy. When he was about 8, his father gave him a small drum. Many days he would play it for himself, calling the other boys and girls to dance just like the grown-ups. They would copy the funeral, wedding, and fetish dances, which are all quite similar, and only a keen ear can tell them apart. They played house and pretended to cook and clean, but not for long. One day was especially exciting. After an argument with the townspeople, Matula's father decided to move the whole village about 1/4 of a mile away. Matula didn't mind the quarrel. He loved the excitement of moving, what we call flitting. Moving a village from one place to another is common there. People move for many reasons: jealousy, sickness, lack of food, or bad neighbors. Those planning to move help each other. First, they choose and mark the new site. Then they take apart their old houses, lifting off roofs, removing walls, and carrying each piece to the new spot. Strong men carry the uprights and ridge poles, and then the roofs. In one day, they can tear down and rebuild several houses. Matula enjoyed helping move his father's houses for his wives and slaves. The quarrel that caused the move didn't last long, and he was happy to return to the old site. He was a cheerful boy those days, especially when his father took him to market. He knew they would not come home empty-handed. But some days he had to wait for hours on the road while his father drank palm wine with friends. Sometimes the children were called to drink too, and so they learned to be drunkards from an early age. As a boy, his mother never let him go to the town dance, a dance beyond words. He watched his parents dress for it, wearing their finest clothes and jewelry. His father draped a leopard skin over himself, hung a knife at his waist, and styled his hair in ridges or shaved patterns, with patches of red ochre on his face. His mother wore bright anklets, a necklace of beads or shells, touches of red on her cheeks, and elaborate haircuts. They usually set off late at night, locking the little ones inside the house. The children fell asleep to the drum's steady thump and the dancer's constant jingle. It was a carefree, happy, yet touching childhood. Matula slept peacefully, unaware of the future trials before him. Oh, childhood! How many would give anything to return to your innocence, your playful pranks? Yet later Matula discovered another childhood, one known only to those who live under the gospel. That alone makes coming to the Congo worthwhile, to bring this true childhood even to those who hear the wild cries of slaves sold or beaten, or the silent groans of their murdered victims. Without Christ, this land remains dark and hopeless, with no restored childhood and no forgiveness for the guilty. Chapter 4. Murder of his father. One day, Mpanzu sent his 10-year-old son to the market with him. Matula was overjoyed, and he never forgot that trip, for it was the last time they went together. In the market, people talked about the many deaths around them and how few children were being born. Everyone feared their people would disappear unless they acted. They talked of two plans: to form a secret society called Ndenbo, described in Mr. Bentley's Pioneering on the Congo, or to find the witch they blamed for the deaths. After much debate, they chose the secret society, hoping it would protect the young if the elders died. Matula did not hear when the Ndenbo meeting would be, so he and his father walked home, carefree. His father carried half a sheep to share at home. All the children sat on the ground like puppies, watching him cut the meat. There were so many that it was hard to give everyone a fair share. Matula wanted a big bone, but it went to his older half-brother. He burst into tears, refused the smaller piece, and was sent to bed by his father. He did not remain upset for long. Before bedtime, he heard the drum and the witch doctor's chant. He crept outside and lay on the ground as if dead. Others did the same, covering themselves with cloth. There was singing and gunfire, and then all who died were carried to a camp in the woods just outside town. Matula counted about 100 boys and girls there, most from nearby villages. He stayed in that camp for nearly 10 months, taking part in their empty, sensual rituals. The children chose him as their leader and gave him a new name, Masamba. No one dared come near the camp. To the townspeople, they were truly dead. Matula heard nothing of the world outside until his return, and then he learned the terrible news that his father had been murdered. After they formed the Ndenbo, everyone told themselves that sickness and death would leave them. For a few weeks it seemed to work, but when the cold, dry season arrived, like a harsh winter, it found the weak and old, and every year it claimed its share of graves. They asked, "How can we stop this terrible death? Who is the witch?" Their suspicions fell on one man, Mpanzu. If only he had been happy with one wife and a small trading business, things might have been different. But his ambition and greed did him in, as they have done to many, even in Christian lands. He had over a dozen wives and 30 or 40 children. He was a famous, wealthy trader. So why did he have so many children when others had none or were dying? Why was he rich while his relatives were poor? To them, there was only one answer: witchcraft. They called a big meeting with the witch doctor, but they did not invite Mpanzu. In the middle of the doctor's fierce, swirling dance, he shouted Mpanzu's name.
"It's Mpanzu,"
everyone agreed. They planned that early the next morning, some friends would lure the townspeople away with a controlled bushfire, while Mpanzu would stay behind to drink palm wine with visiting chiefs. At dawn, the hunters set off, excited, chasing rats, wildcats, and antelopes fleeing the flames. Mpanzu felt honored by the chief's arrival. They came in solemn, stately procession, as if they were lords of creation. Mats were laid for them to sit on, and they exchanged formal greetings. Then the calabash of palm wine was brought out, hands clapped, and the drink passed around in proper order. The calabash went around again. When Mpanzu lifted it to his lips, his last drink, the killer standing behind him quietly slipped a noose over his head. They carried him away with no wife or child nearby to weep or plead. Their plan was made in secret, and they took him to an even more hidden spot. There they did their cruel deed, thinking they were doing right by removing a witch. They beat him brutally, then hung him from a tree and left his body to rot. Truly the darkest places on earth hide the worst cruelty. O earth, when will you give up the blood of your slaughtered sons? When will the innocent be avenged? All across the Congo, almost every hour, the cry of some murdered victim rose up, asking for justice. It was a cry in the night, but God, who never sleeps, heard it, and thank God he answered. Today, in part, that answer has come. Peace declared, sin forgiven for all who accept it, even those whose hands are stained with blood. Many in the Congo have atoned for their terrible sins. Through Christ, they stand cleansed and redeemed. Poor Matula felt his father's murder more deeply than any other sorrow he had known. His father had been proud of him. Matula was meant to be his heir. Now he returned to find no money left, his mother sold as a slave to another man, and all his father's slaves and herds scattered by sale. Now this 11-year-old boy must earn his living by trading, both to avoid being sold himself and to help free his mother from slavery. Chapter 5. First news of the white man. Matula was no longer a child. He had to go out into the world to help his mother win her freedom and to care for his 5 younger brothers and sisters. About a year had passed since the last chapter, and now Matula was on his way to market with his mother. He had become a young trader and visited all the nearby markets. There was a rotating daily market held in 4 different towns, returning to the first spot every 4th day. This system meant each town had frequent markets, and in many areas people could reach a market every day with little trouble. On this particular morning, Matula and his mother arrived early at the open market square. Let us join them and watch the traders coming in from every direction. Women carried baskets heavy with kwanga, plantains, palm nuts, ground nuts, nezalu and pineapples, either balanced on their heads or slung over their shoulders. Men appeared too, one with cloth draped over his shoulders, another showing off polished anklets, one dragging a goat by its legs, another carrying 2 chickens under his arm, and yet another with a small bag of salt. The sellers squatted on the ground and arranged their goods in front of them. Buyers wove among the stalls, haggling over small amounts of goods, yet they wasted just as much time, breath, and temper here as they would over large sums back home. Nearby, a group of palm wine drinkers held court, and bundles of firewood lay in waiting. "What's happening, Matula?" his mother asked. "Wait and see," he whispered. Soon a boy knelt to light the firewood. The man with the goat began beating it. Not hard enough to kill at first, but with steady strokes that drove the frightened animal to exhaustion. Finally the goat collapsed, still alive. They dragged it onto the blazing fire. It was too cruel to watch. Better to move on before we hear its desperate bleating. This brutal practice still goes on today, and will not end until a law forbids it. Our own influence, wherever it reaches, stands firmly against such needless cruelty. Leaving that horrifying scene behind, we noticed a crowd staring in another direction. Far off, a long line of men was marching toward the market from Mbanza Makuta, each carrying a gun. "Isn't that against the law?" some asked. "Yes," one replied, "but there's more to it. I've heard there was a war at Makuta. A white man came there months ago, then tried to return. Buaka Matu wouldn't let him pass. He drove him out and shot him." "Is he dead?" another asked. "I don't know," came the answer. "I hope so." "Was he one of the coastal traders?" "No, they say he was a mundel, a man of God, a missionary." Matula listened closely to these rumors. Soon he heard the singer leading a procession nearby, and strained to catch every word of the song that boasted how the white man had been driven off and shot by their mighty chief. At last the singer appeared, his forehead and nose streaked with red. Behind him came the chief, draped in a long cloth and wearing a leopard skin cap, carrying a spear. In single file, about 100 warriors followed, each with a gun or spear. The singer began again. "Great is our chief. Who can stand against him?" The chief paced before the crowd, showing himself off, kusonga as Matula called it. He challenged anyone who sided with the white man and swore that no Nunkwamalu trouser wearer, would ever enter his land again. Only he was chief. The people abandoned their trading, joined the song and dance, and declared, "Never again shall a white man appear in our country." Some of the timid feared the white man might return in force for revenge. In truth, the chief had only wounded the white man, not killed him. That man was Tom Koma, who with Heartland had tried to build a road to Stanley Pool. Because of Bwakamatu's stubbornness, the road effort was abandoned for a time, and Makuta stood alone for several years. About 7 or 8 years later, Mr. Bentley visited the town. He has come twice a year on average ever since, and his work has brought wonderful results. Revenge was taken, but not by sword. Today, Makuta has one of the most thriving sections of our native church. Mr. Bentley describes this transformation in his book. In August 1897, Nkonzi, nephew of Bwakamatu, who had ordered Komba shot, was baptized. A month or 2 later, he felt the need to make amends for his family's great sin. He wanted to send a gift to Komba's father, but being far away, he could only manage something small. He wrote a letter, expressing deep sorrow for the wrong done to his son, who had brought such good news from God. He explained that his uncle Bwaka had acted in ignorance, and begged Komba's father to forgive him and be his friend. Nkonzi had come to know and trust Jesus, and was truly thankful that the gospel had reached his people. This was God's own vengeance, turning many of that proud, wicked chief's relatives to faith. Nkonzi himself, however, did not live long after his misdeed. But that is a brief aside. Returning to Matula, this was the first time he had ever heard of white men, so he listened eagerly to every rumor. He heard them called possessors of 2 legs, as if other men had none. The white men on the coast were traders, but these 2 who came to Makuta were different. They gave away fine cloth and spoke of Nzambi, our god, and strange things like love. These Mundal, white men, were entirely odd. They had no guns and hadn't brought many carriers to force a road. No one knew who they really were or what they wanted. Some believed their home lay at the bottom of the sea. Perhaps they were spirits of sold slaves come back to haunt them. In any case, they were said to be eaters of men, carrying off as many as they could to work in their strange land. The only safe course was never to let them return, and wherever their name was heard, to avoid them as Ndoki, witches. All of this terrified young Matula. As he walked home from market that day with his mother, he prayed he would never meet a white man in his life. Though he tried not to think of them by day, he dreamed of them at night, sometimes in one form, sometimes another, always chasing him, never letting him escape. Yet he was destined to have much to do with these very white men, and, as dreams often turn out opposite to reality, in later years Matula grew to love white men dearly and was glad to turn to them for help and protection. Chapter 6. The White Man. Matula was determined to avoid contact with white men as much as he could. Over the next few years, he made good progress as a trader. Even though he was still young, people saw him as very sharp, and he made money quickly. Before long, he helped his mother buy her freedom, though the price was very high. As he grew older, he went on longer and longer trading trips into the countryside. In early 1885, he joined a group traveling to the north bank of the Congo River, about 80 miles away. On the way, they crossed the large road built by Stanley from Manyanga to the pool, which amazed them. On the other side, they heard rumors about a railway being built, but no one really knew what it was or what it would do. Some in the group had been to Boma and had seen the big steamers there. People said that's the thing, but they couldn't understand how those steamers could ever travel over land. It seemed like magic. Still, they admitted that the white men had a lot of ngangu, cleverness, and there was no telling what they might do. On the way back, they passed Ngombe, Wathan, where a new station was being set up, moved from Manyanga. This was the first time Matula ever saw a white man, though only from a distance, as they moved quickly through the area, afraid of being cursed. Yet Matula was very impressed with the white man's ngangu. He saw that the area around Ngombe was a great place for trade, so he came back often with sheep, goats, pigs, and other goods, though he stayed away from the station and didn't go near it for about 2 more years. Then he came to sell sheep at Vunda, about 2 hours away, and stopped by Nolemvo's place, Mr. Bentley's assistant in translation. To honor the visit, he killed a sheep and gave the heart to Nolemvo as a sign of friendship. Not long before Nolemvo's own baptism, as a committed follower of Christ, he spent a lot of time talking to Matula. But it was hard for Matula to believe that the customs of his people were completely wrong, or to stop being suspicious of the white man. In the morning, Nolemvo got Matula to join him for prayers in a small grass prayer house. Everything felt strange to Matula. When everyone closed their eyes to pray, he kept his open, afraid something might be done to him when he wasn't looking. Still, the first seed had been planted and the first step taken. He went on to Vunda with his sheep, where he met Mr. Cameron, who was visiting for the day. Matula was surprised at the white man's Ngemda friendliness toward the people. They watched his every move, examined his clothes and belongings, and were especially fascinated by how his food was prepared and the table set. It was as if they had never seen anyone eat before. They all crowded around to watch him use a knife and fork. When he gave out a few biscuits, which were broken into pieces so everyone could have some, they were overjoyed and burst into laughter. But when he started to talk about the one in whose name he had come, it was like he had a disease. Everyone quickly went back to their houses. Still, Matula remembered his kind face and smile, and something began to grow in his heart. He started to feel that the white man was a friend. The fear was gone, but most people still rejected the new teaching, and that held Matula back for several years. Soon after, Mr. Bentley began visiting the Makuta district. After some time, the people of Tongwa decided to give him a boy to help him, which surprised and pleased him. The chief said he would bring the boy himself. When Matula heard about this, he chose to join them on a trading trip. Everything went smoothly until they reached Kinketa, about 4 or 5 hours from Ngombe. As they entered the town in single file, Matula leading a sheep, a man stepped out demanding, "Pay the tax." They ignored him and walked on. Another man did the same, but they kept going. Farther ahead, they were stopped by a group with guns. Those in the back ran off. Matula was caught and tied up, his sheep taken, and he was fined 500 brass rods to let the others continue. They had no choice but to pay. This happened just as they were beginning to take interest in the white man's teachings, making it especially unfortunate. Thankfully, the government later put an end to this illegal taxation. In 1890 and 1891, Mr. Bentley passed through Matula's village, but Matula was away both times. It wasn't until 1894, after Mr. Bentley returned from his time in England, that they finally met again. Matula was just setting out on another trading journey when he met Mr. Bentley heading toward Mongo. Matula had a brother suffering from a serious, long-lasting ulcer, so he asked the missionary to come see him. Matula gave up his planned journey and ran back home to tell his family that the missionary was coming. Then he went out to meet him and led him into the heart of the town. The missionary treated the ulcer, and Matula was so pleased that he brought 2 large chickens as a matabish gift. But Mr. Bentley, from past experience, had learned to refuse such gifts, because they often caused trouble. Some people thought the missionary was like the fetish doctors, who charged far too much, and others accused him of only coming to take things without giving enough in return. So Mr. Bentley kindly declined the gift, and instead sat down to speak with the people, who seemed ready to listen. Many had never heard the gospel before. He told them about the God whose name they knew, the one who made them and everything else, who gave rain and sunshine to help their food grow. This God always cared for them, yet they were ungrateful, and their ways were wrong in his sight. He spoke of God's love in sending Jesus to save them from their sins and to give them power to overcome evil and live holy lives. He warned them of the coming judgment, when all their actions would be brought to account, for God sees everything. He urged them to turn to Jesus, the only one who could save them. After he left, the people talked a lot about what he said, but their old ways and customs were precious to them. Why should they accept new teachings? They said these new things were just kindoki, witchcraft, because their crops grew and rain fell through the power of Nkisi, fetishes. So they believed anything outside of fetishism must be sorcery. In their thinking, everything was either witchcraft or fetishism, and nothing else. Yet one man in that crowd thought deeply about what he had heard, and that man was Matula. This was another step forward for him. He now believed that the white men were not only friendly, but that what they taught was good and worth remembering. He looked for chances to learn more. He visited Bukusu, who had recently come back to Tungwa. Matula became very interested in him, looked through his books, and wished he could read. From then on, he made up his mind to have his own boy taught. When Matula returned, he told his friends about his plan, but they were upset and tried hard to change his mind. Still, he made arrangements with 2 boys to go with Mr. Bentley the next time he visited. However, Matula's mother found out and secretly paid the boys to disappear as soon as Mr. Bentley arrived, and not to come back until he had left. A few weeks later, Mr. Bentley, remembering Matula's interest, visited again. Matula told him he had 2 boys ready. Mr. Bentley stayed just 1 night, and in the morning Matula sent for the boys, but they were nowhere to be found. Realizing he had been tricked, he told Mr. Bentley he would follow after him with at least 1 boy. Messengers were sent out to search, and finally 1 boy was found just as Mr. Bentley was about to leave the town. He was a big, cheerful boy of about 13, wearing a new singlet Matula had given him and holding a rat in his hand. His name was Manquenia. Matula told him he was going to become a white-black man, Mondele Anayombe, like Bukusu, and promised to visit him, bringing money and chickens. That was enough to excite any boy. With a bright smile, Manquenia said Kiambote, goodbye, to everyone, and happily joined the small caravan on the journey to Wathan, not worried at all about witches or sorcery. Chapter 7. Matula's Conversion. As soon as Manquenia left Mongo, the people began to turn against Matula. They now saw clearly that he had broken from their ways and joined the white man's side. His mother cursed him and called him a witch, so Matula stayed away from home as much as he could, going on trading trips. He himself didn't fully understand the new feelings stirring in his heart, but he couldn't turn away from them. Meanwhile, Manquenia was doing fairly well at school. He soon moved past learning the alphabet and joined the syllable class. He was a cheerful, laughing boy with a good temper, and he quickly made friends with everyone. He had arrived at the mission station just a few months before my own arrival, and I remember the first time I saw him. He was wearing an old, torn singlet, against the rules, which he kept trying to pull back on. His face was full of mischief and fun. Watching him run with the other boys was something to see. Because he was so fat and flat-footed, he was always the one left behind. It was a real loss to the station when a few months later he went back to his town with Mr. Bentley and never returned. We were all quite sorry, as we had grown fond of him. He was easily influenced. Just as he had happily gone to the station, drawn by Matula's promises of gifts, he stayed behind in his village when his mother tempted him with her best dishes. He listened eagerly to her story, how she had been mourning for him, afraid he had been eaten, and how sure she was that he would be eaten if he went back. He didn't really believe her story about being eaten, but he didn't like to see anyone sad. Her tears and pleas convinced him to stay and not meet Mr. Bentley as planned. From our limited view, it seemed like a disappointment, but in truth, it was something to be thankful for. Matula didn't have the heart to fight his aunt, a second time, about Manquenia. But he still deeply wanted to know all that the boy had learned at Ngombe. The two of them often sat together, talking for hours. Manquenia did his best to tell Matula about the great God he had heard of, and about Jesus Christ, his son. Matula tried hard to take in every word. Then, wherever Matula went, he would tell others about the strange and wonderful things Manquenia had shared with him. Matula often saw the boy studying his Moelo Azai, Gate of Knowledge, the first Congo reading book, and he would sit next to him to learn. They agreed to hold their own little school each day. Poor Manquenia. This was not easy for him. In his cheerful and easygoing way, he had forgotten some of the letters, so it was no surprise when P turned into B or D, and M looked like W, or N like U. Somehow even F got mixed up with T, so they didn't make much progress, but Matula felt they were moving forward. In the evenings, Matula would gather everyone who was willing to come and sing together. Manquenia taught them the simple songs he had learned, like Jesus Loves Me, or Follow, Follow, I Will Follow Jesus. Matula later said he couldn't guarantee they sang correctly, but he was sure they sang with all their hearts. He would walk about a mile in different directions to hear if their singing carried through the evening air. If he couldn't hear it well, he would come back and say,
Shout louder, raise your voices.
If he could hear it clearly, he'd return and say,
Wambote Kikilu. It is very good.
And then they would sing it all over again. Is there any more touching picture than this group of souls just stepping out of darkness into the first light of dawn? None of them truly understood the meaning of the beautiful hymn they sang to the tune of Jesus Loves Me.
Jizu ntuzole. Nkand a nzambi nvovele wo. Yeto awonso tu anandi. Okutulundanga. Jizu ntuzolele bio. Elo ntuzolele. Jizu ntuzolele. Oyandi nkundi eto.
Translation:
Jesus, he is loving us. The book of God has told us this. Truly we, his people, are. He keeps us with great care. Jesus, he is loving us. Yes, he is loving us. Jesus, he is loving us. Our only friend is he.
Everywhere Matula and his wife went, they sang these simple hymns and shared with the people what they were learning. For a time, Matula stopped going on trading trips so he could fully give himself to these new experiences. It's hard to say exactly when the spiritual awakening of a soul truly begins. Matula himself wasn't sure when it happened, but it was clear that God had started a work of grace in his heart. Around that time, the chief of Makuta, where Ponda had recently begun to teach, came to visit Mongo. He told Matula how he had started learning to read, ABD, since the Congo language has no C, but he found that it led to more than just reading. It brought him to the New Testament, Akangu Diampa, which spoke against drunkenness, adultery, lying, murder, and so on. Since he didn't want to give up these things, he stopped learning and turned away from Christianity. Matula was still unsure about many things. He didn't yet understand it all, but was trying to follow the little light he had. He knew that things like murder and adultery were against God's teaching. He had even hated murder before ever hearing about God. But he didn't yet realize that drunkenness also displeased God. So, in trying to encourage the chief of Makuta to keep learning and attending prayers, Matula told him that he could still read and pray while drinking all the palm wine he liked. The chief agreed, saying, "All right, let's at least have some palm wine." A calabash was brought, and both of them drank quite a bit. Then Matula began to sing, not with the filthy songs of drunkenness, but with the beautiful words of Tom Comba's hymn, set to the tune of Lord, a little band and lowly. Rousseau.
Nzambi settle no kwa ankenda. No matale nsi. Zero konso nsi kwa nsoki yasibma. Tombe kingi kiabukowa. Nzambi seseto u nkwankenda. Toma tale nsi zeto.
Translation:
God our Father, full of kindness, look upon our country, every land which sin has cursed, and where deep darkness still remains. God our Father, full of kindness, look upon our country.
People thought Matula had gone mad. Who had ever heard of a drunk man singing hymns? His name spread across the region, and many came from far away just to see him. Eventually he came to understand that drunkenness was shameful and a serious sin before God, and he gave up drinking palm wine. In this country, as in others, drunkenness is a deep curse, but nearly every Christian on the Congo is a total abstainer. Matula was slowly growing under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, but the devil doesn't give up his servants without a fight. He followed Matula closely and seemed to win when Matula got drunk. But what must he have thought when that same drunk man began singing a prayer to God the Father? Still, Satan believed he could win another way. If he couldn't drag Matula down through drunkenness, he would use pride, the greatest snare for many. Matula was becoming well known, and stories of his actions spread through every town and market. Who could resist such fame? But thank God, the devil does not win every battle for the soul. The Holy Spirit had begun a great work in Matula's heart, and it would not fail. To rescue Matula from his rising pride, something too subtle for him to handle alone, he had to be brought low. For a while, it looked as though he had completely given up his faith. And so it happened. Not long after the visit from the Makuta chief, Matula's mother became very sick. A deep darkness came over him. The old superstitions he had been shedding now clung to him more tightly than ever, trying to hold him back. People said his mother had been bewitched. Matula became convinced that Manquenia was the one who had done it. After all, he had brought these new teachings, which many said were witchcraft. It was a terrible moment. Matula gathered the people and declared that he believed the boy was a witch. He ordered the women not to go to the market and forbade both them and Manquenia from leaving the village while his mother was ill. And Matula, who once hated the crime of killing someone accused of witchcraft, now made a horrifying threat. If his mother died, Manquenia would be killed too. He commanded the boy to stop singing, stop teaching, and never again speak about God's words. Many people supported him, glad to see Matula returning, indeed going even further, into his old heathen ways. For several days there was deep anxiety. It seemed as though the devil might truly win. Matula's mother hovered between life and death, but slowly she began to recover. This, for a time, made Matula more confident in the old ways, yet it was surely God's hand that kept him from shedding blood, so that later, when he would face accusations, he could truthfully say he had never murdered or even helped to kill anyone. In the months that followed, Matula slipped back into his old ways. He stopped trying to learn, stopped singing, and tried to forget about God entirely. To distract himself, he turned heavily to slave dealing and resumed his former trading habits. He filled his time with markets and the routines of his past, trying to silence the voice of conscience. One day his trading brought him to Makuta. The chief there welcomed him warmly and praised him for giving up God's palaver. For the next few days, they threw themselves into enjoying native life. His wife Kento came with him. She was, without doubt, one of the most faithful and devoted women among the Congo people. The evening before they left, they heard singing from the prayer group led by Pond. They were drawn to it and went to listen. As they sat there, they were both deeply convicted. God's Spirit stirred their hearts. They wept bitterly as they remembered how they had once sung those very hymns with joy, and how happy they had been. That memory moved them to a firm decision. They would seek these things again, and nothing else. Matula's first step was to make peace with Ponda. In that culture, this was a significant event, almost like a formal engagement. Matula invited Ponda to visit his town, and Ponda gladly accepted, soon arriving in Mongo. Matula was overjoyed. To honor the occasion and confirm their friendship, he prepared a generous meal with various foods and even boiled 2 chickens, a costly gesture. He also brought a large sheep as a gift for Ponda, though Ponda wisely refused it to avoid gossip about greed. This friendship between Matula and Ponda became deep and lasting until Ponda's death in 1898, a story told by Meister Bentley. After the meal, Matula gathered the people again, saying he wanted to restart the teaching and singing now that Ponda was with them. Many came to meet him, someone they had known since childhood. Then followed a wonderful time of singing. Matula later said,
We only knew 1 or 2 hymns, but Ponde knew so many.
Manquenia helped where he could, and the rest just did their best, opening their mouths and copying the sounds. What a sight it must have been, perhaps more pleasing to God than many grand choirs, dressed in fine clothes and singing polished music. For in that little group there were hearts stirred and lives awakened. They sang not for the music, but for what the songs meant. From time to time, Ponde paused to explain the words of the hymns. Then he shared the story of his own conversion and how he had come to trust in Jesus. What a change it brings to life. Ponde spoke from personal experience, how the message of Christ could turn a sullen man into someone kind, and a quick-tempered man into one who is gentle. This went far deeper than Matula had imagined. He had understood that Christianity must stop outward, obvious sins, but he hadn't thought of the everyday faults, the quiet habits and inner struggles common to every person, as sins too, let alone that they should be changed. He listened eagerly. He was learning more about Christ. Not only that Jesus saves from the punishment of sin, but that he also frees from its power. Here before him stood someone he had known since childhood, and now that man's life was completely transformed. Matula was deeply impressed. Though his own pride was starting to be humbled, he still struggled with fierce bursts of anger, a weakness that would later bring him pain. But those days, which Matula now remembers with joy, were days of peace before a coming storm. In that time, he learned much about God's power, and a simple, firm faith was planted in him, a faith he has never lost. Even in his hardest trials, he could always say with strong and sincere conviction,
God, my Father, knows.
Chapter 8. Troubles and Trials. Funerals in Congo are usually carried out according to the customs of each town or district. Still, there are some common features, especially when someone important dies. The body is often smoked for several days over a small fire, then wrapped in cloth, sometimes only 1 or 2 pieces. In this state, the body might be kept for weeks, months, or even years. This gives time for friends and relatives to compete in bringing the largest gifts or the most cloth for wrapping the body before burial. For great chiefs, gunshots are fired, drums and horns are played almost non-stop, and the whole town takes part in a feast. On the day of burial, people come from all around. The body, wrapped in many layers of cloth, is buried along with nearly all the possessions the person had in life. 2 or 3 years ago, the great chief of this area died. While his body lay in state, between 50 to 100 goats were killed, along with many chickens. Around 500 small kegs of gunpowder were fired. His body was wrapped until it was the size of a dining table. About 200 pieces of cloth, equal to 1,600 yards, were buried with him, along with several heavy ivory tusks and expensive leopard and wild animal skins. Every man hopes his funeral will be so extravagant that people will talk about the amount of wealth used, and many begin saving for it from childhood. On the day of the funeral, during the feasting, fights often break out, and knives are sometimes drawn. In this, they're not far behind the native Irish in knowing how to hold a dramatic wake. Just a few days after the events of the previous chapter, one of the mothers of Matula's second wife died at Nzundu. Matula went to show respect. He brought generous gifts and several pieces of cloth and stayed for the burial. The people were surprised that he wouldn't drink palm wine, a habit he had given up after becoming friends with Ponde. He explained the change in his heart and how much better it was to follow God and leave the old ways behind. But the people didn't listen closely. They were sure something was wrong with him. Still, they didn't forget his words, and would remember them later to use against him. The day after the burial, Matula was on his way back to Mongo and stopped at a market along the road. While he waited, a drunk man from Nzundu approached him and asked for a piece of cloth. Matula refused, knowing that if he gave in, all his possessions would soon be taken by lazy relatives. But the man had been encouraged to provoke Matula. He followed him home, and after some insistence, Matula gave him just enough cloth to cover himself. Instead of being grateful, the man insulted Matula, calling him stingy and accusing him of using the new God's palavers to bewitch people and get rich. His anger boiled over, and he struck Matula on the head with a stick. Caught off guard and overcome with rage, Matula rushed inside, grabbed his gun, and fired at the man, but missed. He immediately regretted it. The man fled, yelling to his people that Matula had shot him. He said nothing about the provocation. This was enough to stir the whole town to fury. Armed with guns, they stormed over to Mongo. As the women fled into the forest, and only a few men remained, Matula tried to resolve the situation by talking and offering to pay a fine. But they refused to listen. They captured him and locked him in a house, planning to kill him that evening. They believed the house was secure, it didn't have the usual second exit, and sat down to watch. Matula prayed desperately, comforting himself with the words, "God knows." Searching for a way out, he noticed a corner of the gable end that wasn't tightly bound. Quietly lifting one of the small crossrods and parting the grass, he slipped through into the thick woods behind the house. There he found a small trail leading to a river. He walked in the water to avoid leaving footprints. Soon after, his captors checked the house and were stunned to find it empty. "He must have used witchcraft," they exclaimed. "What a witch he is!" They believed he had been too scared to run, as many had been before. They called out, but no one answered. Then they looted everything they could find and searched for the women. Eventually they found Maluvunu, Matula's sister, and took her with them. When they reached Nzundu, they fired guns and wasted powder to celebrate her capture and stir courage for a planned attack on Mongo the next day. They expected Matula's friends would try to rescue her. Meanwhile, Matula remained in hiding. He barely slept that night. When he heard the gunfire from Nzundu, he guessed they had returned, but he could only wonder what they had done to his town. The next morning, as Matula cautiously made his way back toward Mongo, he spotted the Nzundu people marching toward his town. He boldly called out,
"Wait for me, and I will go along with you."
Hearing Matula's voice suddenly and not seeing him, they were seized with panic. In fear and confusion, they all turned and fled back to Nzundu. Once they were gone, Matula rose from hiding and continued his journey. As he neared Mongo, he met his relatives armed and ready to march, determined to rescue Maluvunu and avenge the attack on Matula. He tried to stop them, urging peace and saying it was wrong to fight. He encouraged them to find another way to settle the conflict, but they wouldn't listen and went on without him. Warfare in Congo tends to be more dramatic than deadly. A simple rain shower can delay a battle indefinitely. What they truly seek is noise. If enough gunpowder is fired, they call it a great battle. Since no one wants to be shot, everyone tries to stay out of harm's way. Injuries, let alone deaths, are rare. These two groups met the next day, and after much firing, one man on the Nzundu side was slightly wounded. Blood had been drawn, so the next day they tried to even the score. This time, they succeeded beyond their intent. One of Matula's people was killed. That put an end to the fighting, for now. They paused to figure out what had caused the man's death. Tragically, the people still believed in witchcraft and accused Matula of murder. Even though he wasn't present at the battle, they blamed him. To a reasonable person, it would make no sense. Why would Matula want one of his own men dead? But they reasoned that because he had caused the war, he was responsible. Also, they feared that if they didn't accuse him, he might demand heavy damages from the man who had killed his relative. So the war stopped for the time being, and the focus shifted entirely to Matula. They labeled him a witch and called for his death. Now he faced a different kind of battle, not one fought with guns, but a spiritual war against the deep darkness that sought to destroy him. Chapter 9. Persecution. Now everyone remembered everything Matula had ever said about God's palavers, and rightly so, for he had never hidden the light he had received, and he had never been ashamed to speak of Christ before others. But to most of the natives, these teachings were sorcery. So when poverty, sickness, and death spread among his relatives, they blamed him. Unless he gave up these new beliefs and returned to his old ways, they said, he would have to be killed. Most of his old friends abandoned him and joined those who accused him of being a witch. One old chief, who had once been a close friend to Matula, now decided it was his duty to lead the first attack on him. The chief was cunning and laid his plan carefully. He announced a great fetish ceremony to renew the power of his Nkisi for hunting and fighting. But secretly, he told his people the real purpose was to kill Matula when he came. The plan was to pretend the chief was sick or come up with another excuse to summon Matula. Then they would kill him. Everyone involved was sworn to secrecy. Everything was prepared, and they waited for the appointed day. But there was one true friend among them who pretended loyalty to the chief. He flattered him and asked for permission to go to the market to fetch some palm wine. Taking a roundabout route, he stopped at Mongo to warn Matula not to go, no matter what message came. That evening, a messenger arrived saying the chief was seriously ill and wanted to see Matula. But Matula's brother would not allow him to go. Instead, he went himself and found the chief genuinely very sick. He had suddenly fallen ill. The next day, the very day he had planned Matula's murder, the chief died. It was a direct intervention by God. Let others explain it how they wish. Not long after, the older brother who had gone in Matula's place died. Before his death, he gathered his brothers and gave each a stick, saying, "It is your place to settle matters and fight if needed. But leave Matula alone. Let him live in peace, trade, and pray to God." Sambila Nzambi. In Congo, the words of a dying man are deeply respected, even more than in many other cultures. So Matula's immediate family largely left him in peace. However, his enemies, who came from the senior branch of his family, only saw more reason to persecute him. How could they attack him now? They had already tried murder twice, and each time he had escaped in astonishing ways. So these servants of darkness invented a charge of adultery against him and 4 of his younger brothers. They found a woman willing to accept a large bribe to lie, and she accused Matula. He was brought before 2 powerful chiefs, one the chief of the woman, the other a leader who had recently lost many people to illness. The first fined him 40 men for the deaths, and the second fined him 300,000 nzimbu, roughly £26, for adultery. It was an absurd judgment, but there was no way to fight it. His enemies believed they had finally succeeded, that Matula would be sold into slavery. Matula feared the same and told his wife, Kento, to return to her people for her safety. But she replied, like someone from scripture she had never heard of, "Where you go, I will go. If you go into slavery, so will I." Nothing could persuade her to leave him. To the surprise of his enemies, Matula began doing all he could to pay the fine. He managed to pay half the money and surrender 5 men. He also had many sheep scattered across the country that he hoped not to lose. It became clear he would likely succeed in paying the full fine. So his enemies began plotting again, this time determined to create a new accusation that would surely cost him his life. One man remembered that some years earlier a woman had died under unusual circumstances, though it was actually smallpox that killed her. Now they planned to use that incident against Matula. Their goal was to accuse him of murder. The state had recently arrived in Tumba, about 6 hours away, and had begun enforcing new laws, one of which threatened death by hanging for anyone convicted of murder. So if Matula could be formally charged and handed over to the authorities, his enemies believed they could finally be rid of him without laying a hand on him themselves. They bound him and took him to Tumba as a criminal, accusing him of murder. At the beginning of 1896, Tumba was a wilderness. By midsummer, it had become a bustling construction site, and by the end of the year, it had transformed into a thriving town. Traders' shops sprang up like mushrooms, an almost unbelievable number for the area. A residence was built for the commissioner, along with government buildings and barracks for over 50 soldiers. Some readers may recall Tumba as the site of one of the most heartbreaking stories in the history of the Congo mission. Mr. Stevens started the station there in May 1896. At the end of the year, when Mr. and Mrs. Popel arrived, he moved upriver to Yakusu for further work. Mr. Popel struggled with illness for months and died the following April. Just 6 weeks later, his wife died too, and was buried beside him. Early that same year, Matula was taken to Tumba to stand trial, accused of murder and adultery. At the time, the judge only visited the town occasionally, and depended heavily on a native interpreter, who was easily bribed. In fact, most non-Christian natives were known to accept bribes as readily as flowers receive sunlight. Skilled speakers and often bold liars, they could convincingly make evil appear good and twist an innocent person's character into that of a villain. Their performance could deceive even the sharpest defense counsel unfamiliar with their ways. Matula's enemies prepared their case carefully. Along with the murder charge involving 2 women, they revived the old accusation of adultery, though they didn't emphasize it as much. Still, the woman was present to testify against him. They quickly found the interpreter and offered him a generous bribe, promising more if Matula were sentenced to death. A few days later, Matula's case was brought before the court. The interpreter presented the charges to the judge and gave a detailed account, based entirely on the version from Matula's accusers, of the events and of Matula's supposed character. Witnesses were called, all of them false, to support the accusations. Their testimony painted Matula as an umpwimbihi, a wild, lawless man, and claimed the country would be better without him. Then came the defense witnesses. They could only speak of Matula's character and say they believed he was innocent, but under cross-examination it came out that Matula had been fined on several occasions and was seen by local chiefs as an umpwimbulu, a troublemaker. Their testimony, instead of helping, strengthened the prosecution's case. Things looked very bad for Matula. His enemies were rejoicing. Then the judge called on Matula to speak for himself. Calmly and plainly, Matula gave a truthful account of his relationship with those who were accusing him. He ended by saying,
My lord, these people have sought my life and have tried to kill me many times. God knows I am innocent of these charges. I have never killed nor helped to kill anyone.
The judge was deeply impressed by his honest and simple words. He found himself torn. Should he accept one man's word against many witnesses? He knew his interpreter believed Matula was guilty. During the lunch break, the judge weighed his decision. He was scheduled to leave the next morning. Should he sentence Matula to be hanged now? No, he decided not to. Instead, he would give Matula a chance to prove his innocence. When court resumed, the judge called Matula forward and said,
Your case is very serious, but as you said, God knows whether you are innocent or not. I am going to release you for a few months, but when you are summoned again, you must come. And unless you bring more evidence of your innocence, the judgment will go against you.
Matula thanked the judge, and, much to the anger of his enemies, walked out of the court a free man, at least until the judge returned. When Matula returned to Mungo, his wives and sisters, exhausted from crying and having given him up for dead, were overjoyed to see him alive. But their joy quickly faded when he told them he would have to return to Tumba. He saw no way to strengthen his defense. His accusers were confused by the delay. They began to worry that Matula might escape judgment altogether. Not willing to leave the matter in the state's hands, they resumed harassing him. They sent messengers again and again to see if he was still in town, though none dared approach too closely, fearing he was in league with evil spirits. Still, they resolved to form a strong party to capture him, and a friend warned Matula that they would arrive in 2 days. Poor Matula. Though he believed God was with him, he felt weary from being constantly hunted. In that moment of deep need, he longed for someone, anyone, to stand by him and help. But who was there? Pond, though faithful, had no influence to protect him. Matula feared that even going to him would only stir up more anger from his enemies. It was a time of great testing for his faith. If he turned his back on Christianity and gave up all he had to his accusers, they would let him live. The question now stood before him. Should he give in to save his life? Chapter 10. Exodus. The temptation was very real. Unless he made peace with his enemies, there seemed to be no hope of escape, at least from a human perspective. He had only 2 days to decide. He thought and prayed deeply about it. Then, as if by revelation, the thought came. What about the missionaries? At that he danced with joy. Why hadn't he thought of it before? To us it seems strange, and must be counted among those odd lapses that happen in almost every life. As soon as the idea came, he resolved to act on it. He told Manquenia to go ahead and let Mr. Bentley know he was coming, bringing with him as many of his people as would join. Then he visited his closest relatives and shared his decision to go and settle at Ngombe. His 2 wives agreed right away, as did most of his family, though some preferred to stay home rather than move to an unfamiliar place. They packed quickly, prepared food for the journey, and were ready to leave the night before his enemies were expected to capture him. They set off in the dark, a small group of 37, including his nearly 60-year-old mother and a baby just a few months old. Some had severe leg ulcers, one was lame, and another hadn't walked in weeks. What a mixed group they were. It's a mystery how they managed to travel the 60 miles without accident or injury. Surely God was with them. They walked all night and rested near the railway at dawn. While eating breakfast, someone shouted, "Soldiers!" The women ran into the tall grass, and the men looked frightened. But it was a false alarm. Just one soldier passed by, not recognizing them, and simply greeted them with a "good morning" before moving on. They walked a little farther along the railway and met some white men who asked where they were going. They said they were heading to their friends at Ngombe. Oui, to Monsieur Bentley," the men replied, then continued on their way. The journey from there was exhausting, up hills and down valleys, through marshes and swamps, until they finally reached Kinkete, the place where Matula had paid taxes back in 1891. They rested there for a while. The locals urged Matula to settle among them and even returned the unjust tax they had taken. But since there were no Christians there, and he did not feel safe among others, he refused. Still, 1 or 2 of his group stayed behind for a time. About an hour from Kinkete lived Selulundi, one of the most remarkable and upright chiefs in the area. He knew Matula well and tried to persuade him to settle with him. But Matula was eager to be near the white missionary. However, he left the weaker ones with Selulundi and continued the journey with the rest to Ngombe, about 4 hours further. Matula was not disappointed in the welcome he and his group received. He immediately felt that, as far as human help could reach, the missionary would do all he could for them. So he looked for a place and began building a home. A few days later, Matula went back for the rest of his large family, who had stayed behind to rest. He found that one of his sisters had given birth to a child, a bright little girl who now runs happily around the station. To his surprise, he also met 9 of his brothers who hadn't been in Mongo when he left. When they heard where he had gone, they decided to follow and settle with him. This was a great encouragement and showed how much they trusted him. The next day, they all set out for Ngombe and arrived in the evening, feeling they had finally found a place of peace and safety, free from the threat of enemies. It was a great joy for us to welcome such a large group to the little village of Vianga, named after Tom Comber, now being built just outside our grounds. We were especially glad because we want the village to grow with new people rather than just those already at the station, to bring fresh energy and avoid forming a closed circle that might hinder rather than help. What Matula did was a courageous act. He had received a call, just as clearly as Abraham long ago: "Leave your country, your people, and your father's house." And didn't he obey that call just as faithfully? It was no small thing to place all his trust in a missionary, someone he had been taught to see as an enemy of his people. Some might say he simply chose the lesser of 2 evils. But could that be? If he had stayed in Mongo, only he would have been killed. But by leaving, he placed himself and all his loved ones in the hands of God's servants. It was a pure, simple, and honest faith, and God has greatly blessed him for it. They arrived near the end of the wet season, a poor time to start planting, but a good time to begin building. Everyone threw themselves eagerly into the task of creating a new village. During the remaining rainy days, the women worked at digging and planting manioc, while the men gathered sticks and grass for constructing houses. It was a very busy season. We supported them as best we could, allowing them to buy food from our daily stock when they couldn't get enough from the local people. Yet they never became too busy to miss the daily prayer meetings. All of them came regularly, and for us, having over 40 people join in daily worship was a great encouragement. It brought real joy to see them grow more attentive, and over time, to witness many of them openly take their stand for the Lord. But I am getting ahead of the story. By mid-August, all their houses were built and their gardens ready for planting, a record time for natives in the Congo. During these months, Matula remained surprisingly calm and cheerful. The women would sometimes break down in tears, fearing he might have to return to Tumba to face the judge and his accusers. There still seemed no way to strengthen his case to prove his innocence. We, of course, could only speak to the character we had observed. But Matula never became discouraged. He saw clear signs of God's help and blessing. Being innocent, he firmly believed that God would one day reveal the truth. It was this confidence that gave him peace. Chapter 11. Revisiting his people. From the time Matula arrived at Ngombe, he worked hard to make his people happy and comfortable. As we've seen, by mid-August they were well settled. Then his thoughts turned from those who were safe to those who were still in danger. He didn't know how long he himself would be spared. He could be summoned to Tumba at any time, and it seemed there could only be one outcome. But this he knew. If he were hanged, his enemies would steal everything he had left behind in Mongo and secretly sell his closest relatives into slavery. Longing to protect them physically, but even more spiritually, he decided to return once more to the place of his trials and make another effort to save his people. When word spread that he was going back to Mongo, his friends tried hard to change his mind. His poor old mother clung to him and begged him with tears not to risk it again. To them, it seemed like a sure path to death. But like Paul, he would not be persuaded to turn back. 2 of his brothers went with him. After 2 days of good travel, they arrived on the evening of the 3rd day and quietly entered the house of a friend. In the morning, when he went out, his relatives, who never expected to see him again, were overjoyed. They ran about shouting, "Matula has returned!" But he cautioned them not to make too much noise. He told them why he had come and pleaded with them to leave everything and come hear the Nsangu Zambote, the good news, at the mission station. But they refused. "No, no," they said, "not us. We're living in the abundance you fools ran away from. There are plenty of gardens, goats, sheep, and chickens. We're not going." He warned them that if he was killed, they might be sold into slavery. But like Lot's sons-in-law, they mocked him. As is common among natives, they only thought of the present moment. They took quite literally our Lord's words, "Do not be anxious about tomorrow. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." They made no distinction between being over-anxious and simply being prepared. To them, worry of any kind was pointless. They chose to live one day at a time. Carefree, yes, but not without consequence. Matula was not there long before word spread that he had returned. People came to see him and accused him of betraying them to the white men at Ngombe. Mr. Bentley happened to be in the area at the time, so they were too afraid to harm Matula. Still, he knew he needed to act quickly. He wanted to take a few of his sheep with him, but found only 9. Many had already been stolen and sold. He asked one of his brothers to lead the sheep ahead. When his enemies heard this, they went ahead of him and set fire to the tall grass in a narrow, enclosed area. The sheep panicked and ran through the flames. 1 died, and the rest were badly singed. Grass fires occasionally lead to deaths, though not often. In 1901, a woman and her child were burned alive. However, the wider roads enforced by the government have helped prevent such tragedies. It became clear that Matula's enemies were still very active, so he gathered his people again and pleaded with them not to remain behind. After much discussion, they took a vote. Many who just days earlier had said, "We will not go," now voted eagerly to leave the hostile region. This change of heart, typical of their shifting feelings, was prompted by whatever seemed most urgent at the moment. A group of them soon left, but Matula and his 2 companions stayed behind. He still hoped to speak once more with those who had been persecuting him and try to make peace, for he had learned to love even his enemies, a hard lesson for even the most mature Christians. He went to see Ponda and asked for advice. There he saw the work progressing well. The people of Makuta were eagerly learning, and it lifted his spirits. It made him long even more for the people of his own town to desire the same knowledge. After discussing the matter with Pond, they decided to return together and try to bring back 1 or 2 boys from Mongo to be trained at the mission station. This was their way of showing their zeal to help and save the people. Whether their effort was guided by wisdom or not, readers may judge for themselves. They returned to Mongo, full of love for the people and a deep desire to help them. Both friends and enemies gathered to welcome Pond. Then they spoke to them about God's love, how he cares for us and sent his son Jesus to show that love by dying for us and bearing our sins in his own body, so that even the worst sinner might be saved through him. Matula, with tears in his eyes, shared how he now believed and spoke of all the good news he had heard at Ngombe. He told them he held no bitterness in his heart against them and fully forgave them for how they had treated him. He pleaded with them to turn from their evil ways and seek God. He also spoke of how the people at Makuta were growing in knowledge and gaining wisdom, and how it would be good if they too sent some boys to the mission station, boys who could return and teach them like Ponda was doing. The people listened with great interest and attention. Matula was convinced their hearts were softening. They spoke openly afterward and promised to send a boy or 2 back with him to be trained. That evening, Ponda departed, feeling very pleased with the outcome of the visit. But had he known what was about to happen to Matula, he would surely have stayed until his friend had safely returned to Ngombe. Chapter 12. Treachery. The morning after Ponda left, some of the locals came to Matula and asked when he planned to return to Ngombe. He told them he would go the next day. They then invited him to the Mbanza, the main village of Mongo. That afternoon, saying they had arranged to send 4 boys with him. 2 were ready, and the other 2 would follow later. Matula was overjoyed. In his simple faith, he truly believed they were beginning to change. He thanked God for what he saw as a sign of his blessing. That afternoon, he went with his 2 companions. When they entered the chief's compound, they were surprised to see a large group of people armed with guns, knives, and sticks. Matula realized he had been betrayed, but he sat down among them, trying to remain calm, and began talking with them. They asked questions about the white man and the white man's God, as Matula answered, telling them again of God's love and his own love for them. Murmuring rose among the crowd. They couldn't understand such selfless love. Yes, some said, that's why our people are dying. Matula is selling them all to the white man, who takes them away by some secret means. We must get rid of him, others said. Let's take him to the river and kill him. No, one objected. There are witches there. He might escape. These things they whispered among themselves. Then one bold man said aloud,
Well, Matula, what you've told us is good, and we want to learn too. We have 2 boys up the river. Let's go and fetch them.
Everyone agreed, and Matula and his companions went along. They passed through a wooded area to a lonely house, where they stopped to rest and called for the boys. They called repeatedly and even pretended to go fetch them, but it was all a trick. No boys ever came. Meanwhile, Matula and his 2 friends sat under the eaves of the house and began to read from their Mivelo Azai, New Testaments. But this only enraged the crowd. To them, those books held the names of all they believed Matula had sold. One man jumped up and struck Matula on the head. He stood up, but couldn't defend himself as another man stabbed him in the forehead. Blood gushed down his face. His 2 friends ran, shouting, Matula is murdered. The others then stripped him of his clothes, bound him with ropes, fastened a forked stick around his neck, and led him away in this shameful condition. At first, Matula could hardly stand, and blood nearly blinded him.
Ah,
He said,
God forgive you. Why do you want to kill me? I am going to die, but I am not afraid. If you kill me, you will suffer. Some of you won't even be allowed to bury your own mothers.
referring to one of the greatest tragedies in their culture. But they answered,
You've killed and eaten so many. Think of all those who died because of you. Why should you live? A traitor like you doesn't deserve to live.
He replied,
You accuse me of killing Luvuma, Nzevo, and my mother Mundele, but they are alive and well at Ngombe. As for the others who have died, it was by God's will.
They refused to listen. They dragged him to a small river. There he begged them to kill him. As he crossed the water, he stumbled over a stone. They tied another stick around his neck and pulled him up the other side. Then they led him to another village. The chief there, an old friend, pretended to object, saying,
Don't kill him here. I don't want to see blood.
When Matula begged for a piece of cloth to cover himself, the chief refused.
No,
He said.
take him away.
Matula cried and pleaded to be killed then and there, but they ignored him. Others came to help drag him down into a deep valley, where they tied him to a tree. Some ran off to fetch a chief and others to approve his execution. 2 chiefs and 4 men remained, sitting around a small fire. To them Matula, though weak and suffering, tried to speak.
Now I am dying,
He said.
but I am not afraid. I rejoice, for when I die, I go to God. You cannot kill me unless God allows it.
He begged them to repent. Their only response was,
Let's have something to drink.
one had brought a large calabash of palm wine, and they sat drinking, trying to get drunk, while Matula, beaten and bleeding, watched them in pity. What a scene! It brings to mind the suffering of our Lord Jesus. Yet, thank God, there are still those willing to suffer for his name. The messengers returned, but they hadn't found those most involved in the case.
What shall we do?
One asked.
Let's sell him.
Suggested someone.
No,
Others replied.
that will only cause more problems later. Better to kill him. Let's take him to Chief Kwenkizi and kill him there.
They all agreed. As they went on, some old acquaintances came by, mocking him. He begged one for a piece of cloth.
Not me.
The man sneered.
I'm going to buy you.
When they reached another stream, Matula couldn't go any farther. He lay down and begged through tears.
Kill me, for the angels are waiting to carry my spirit to heaven.
This only made them more furious. They beat him with sticks and ropes.
Have mercy, kill me with a gun.
He pleaded. But they had no such mercy in mind. Like a cat playing with a mouse, they dragged him further along a rough path. Blood seeped from his wounds, but these cruel men showed no pity. When they reached the next village, they summoned a man who had been secretly assigned to kill Matula. He came forward, sharpening a large knife. He reached out his hand to Matula and gave him a kiambote, a farewell. Then, with cold determination, he raised the knife high to strike. But just before he could bring it down, someone stopped him, saying,
Chief Kwenkizi is not here and he must be present.
More discussion followed. They then took Matula on to Kwenkezi's place. The chief was surprised to see them so late, for the sun had long since set. He welcomed them with a feast, though Matula could barely eat. That night, they bound him inside a house. He was laid on his back, arms and legs stretched out and tied to opposite walls. Ropes around his waist were connected to guards on either side, and the forked stick around his neck was fastened to the low roof beam. In his misery, Matula prayed to God, asking for help, for a quick death or for deliverance in some other way. It was a long and sleepless night, but at last the dawn came. No help arrived, yet his faith in God did not waver. Soon a messenger came from Makuta, warning them that word had spread. If the state found out, there would be consequences. Though they ignored the warning, they did slightly loosen the bindings on his legs and relaxed the ropes a bit. Then they led him to the village where the judgment, or palaver, was to take place. There Matula begged the chief for a piece of cloth. The chief, moved perhaps by a trace of mercy, tore his own cloth in two and gave him half. Matula again pleaded with them, warning of the evil they were committing and saying that if they killed him, they would face punishment, if not now, then eventually. But his words had no effect. That night, they tied him again, just as before. In the morning, a large gathering was held. The old accusations of witchcraft were raised once more. He had associated with the missionary, given him a boy, and had taken his people to Ngombe, where they were starting to follow God and this new teaching. It was enough evidence, they said. He must be a witch, and witches, of course, must be killed. The chief presiding over the council called for a vote. Every vote was cast against Matula. They agreed to send for an executioner to carry out the sentence the next day, and Matula's body was to be thrown into the river Kwilu. Not a single voice, not even a faint one, spoke in his defense. That evening, some women noticed a stranger in the woods preparing long cords, and they wondered at his actions. He was the hired killer, getting ready to tie Matula securely for the night to ensure he would not escape before morning. That night, Matula was bound again, his feet tied to heavy iron clogs, his arms fastened together beneath his head, the forked stick once more attached to the low ridge pole, and his waist secured to guards on either side. He was surrounded by 6 guards. To his left lay the murderer, well paid to carry out the execution. To the native mind, everything had been done according to custom. There was no chance of escape. Believing this to be the final night of his life, Matula cried out to God, though with little hope. Unless a miracle happened, he would die in the morning. Chapter 13. Escape. In September 1897, I was traveling to Tumba to visit Meister and Mrs. Graham, who had come from San Salvador to temporarily replace Mr. Popple. As we neared Tumba, we saw Matula's 2 companions running toward us in great haste. Their faces showed alarm, and before we could speak, they cried out,
Matula is murdered.
with tears in their eyes. Surely not, I said. There must be some mistake.
No,
They insisted.
we saw him beaten and stabbed with a knife. There is no mistake.
All right, I said. Mr. Bentley has returned. Go and tell him quickly. We needed to report to the state authorities, for we were responsible for ensuring Matula would appear at Tumba if summoned. The 2 men ran off without waiting to hear more, and we continued our journey, heavy-hearted. None of the boys with us could speak a word. We had all grown to love Matula. His calm, gentle spirit was so different from most others. When we arrived at Tumba, it was the first thing we talked about. The 2 men had also spoken with Mr. Graham. He and Mrs. Graham were as grieved as I was. Though they had only met Matula a few times, they had been deeply impressed by him, and surprised to learn he had not yet been received into church fellowship. A day or 2 later, a letter arrived from Mr. Bentley, addressed to the commissioner, and Mr. Graham was preparing to deliver it. Just then, astonishing news came. Matula had escaped. We questioned the boy who brought the report, but he had only heard it from some travelers coming from the Makuta area. At first, we found it hard to believe. It sounded too miraculous, especially in our skeptical times when people say the age of miracles is over. Soon after, we met some of the men who had tied Matula up, though we didn't realize it at the time, and Mr. Graham questioned them closely. We still feared the escape story was a cover-up for murder, but our doubts didn't last long. Within an hour or 2, Pondi arrived. He confirmed the news, saying he had seen Matula himself after he escaped and that he had come straight to Makuta. Matula was too weak to travel far, so Pondi had left him behind to rest. I had to leave that day with my small caravan, but our hearts were overflowing with gratitude to God for sparing Matula's life and showing his power. We spent another 10 days on the road, visiting villages in my district about 40 miles east of Tumba, and then returned to Ngombe. My colleagues were expecting Matula's arrival at any moment, and many of his people had gone out to meet him at Kimpete. A few days later, they returned, Matula leading them, accompanied by Meister and Mrs. Graham, who were visiting Ngombe. Poor man. He looked utterly exhausted. He said he had delayed coming because he was ashamed for us to see how thin he had become. His people were overcome with joy, and the boys and girls at the station could not have been more thrilled if he had been a white man. Later, he gave us a detailed account of his capture and being dragged from town to town over 2 days and nights. The story you've already read. That's where we left him on the 3rd night, bound hand and foot, awaiting the morning with no hope of rescue, sure that his death was near. With no help left on earth, Matula committed himself to God's care. He prayed for deliverance if it was God's will, or else for restful sleep. All 6 guards had fallen asleep, and Matula himself began to drift off, until he woke with a strange feeling in his feet. What was it? They were burning. Then he realized the truth. His feet had been bound over the ashes of the fire from the night before. Fires in the Congo, like the ancient Druid fires, are rarely fully extinguished. With a bit of dry grass and a breeze, a flame can be rekindled at any time. Rope made from fibrous materials will slowly smolder and eventually break. That's what happened to the cords binding Matula's feet. They smoldered and burned through. What freedom he felt! Though his waist, hands, and neck were still tied, the ability to move his feet gave him leverage. Slowly he worked his hands forward. The cord slipped off the forked stick. He brought his hands in front of him and managed to free them. Still, he had to move carefully. His guards were stirring. Were they awake? He tested them by calling out, asking to be tied again. They made no reply. Whether they were asleep or too afraid to move, he didn't know. Quietly, he wriggled out of the cords around his waist. Now only the iron clogs on his feet remained. He crept to the door and slipped outside into the cool night air. It was refreshing. Looking around for tools, he found a hatchet and a large knife and used them to break free from the irons. Then he ran, any direction, just to get away from that place. He tried to find the road to Tumba, but disoriented and unsure of his location, he couldn't tell which way to go. He followed the first visible path, which led to a cassava garden. Fires burned, and voices could be heard. Natives were out guarding the fields from elephants. He skirted the area to avoid being spotted. Ahead, he came upon an elephant track and saw a mother elephant with her calf. He knew he couldn't risk going that way. He quickly turned aside and found a narrow path that led him to the Kwilu River. As he stood on the bank, he heard the ominous sounds of crocodiles below. He remembered how many people had been killed by them. Terrified, he turned back. What could he do? Returning meant recapture. Going along the elephant path meant facing wild beasts. Entering the river meant risking the crocodiles. Staying in place could bring a buffalo attack. Every option seemed deadly. In desperation, Matula prayed earnestly, asking God, who had just delivered him from his enemies, to now guide his next step. As he prayed, peace came. He felt God's answer. It is better to fall into the hands of God than into those of wicked men. Beasts obey their Creator. They are less dangerous than evil men. With renewed faith, he stepped into the river and swam safely to the other side. The water revived him. He paused to wash away the clotted blood that covered his body. As he did, an antelope and its young came and looked at him, leaving and returning several times. It was as if God had sent this gentle creature as a sign of peace and reassurance. He climbed up the far bank of the river. Now more aware of his surroundings, he carefully continued on, avoiding every village. As dawn approached, he had to be even more cautious. Whenever travelers came near, Matula would hide in the tall grass. He asked several people the way to Makuta, but they were too frightened to answer him. As the morning progressed, more travelers appeared, all heading to the district's large market. Matula saw a group approaching and hid in the woods. Peering through the branches, he recognized two of Ponde's boys leading a goat. When he called to them, they were startled, having heard he was dead. But they stopped and listened as he explained, and then told him Ponde was at home. Encouraged, Matula hurried to Makuta and headed straight for the prayer house, expecting to find Ponde there. He opened the door and called out,
Makan, Ponde. Friend, Ponde.
But a small boy, terrified, rushed out, crying, Matula's ghost has come. Ponde came quickly to see for himself, and to his joy and amazement, there stood Matula, alive. The two embraced out of sheer joy, something very uncommon among the Congo people. Hot water and medicine were quickly brought, and his many wounds were washed and dressed. Then, relieved and safe with a friend, Matula lay down on a mat and soon fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. He remained indoors for several days, lovingly cared for by Ponde as tenderly as a mother would nurse her own child. Word soon spread that Matula had escaped. But his pursuers were too afraid to try capturing him again. They assumed the state would finish the job they had failed to carry out. Matula also anticipated the upcoming trial, but this time, with more hope and confidence, for he had experienced a clear sign of God's power and protection. Chapter 14. Trial at Tumba. Not long after Matula returned to Ngombe, Mr. Graham wrote to Mr. Cameron, Mr. Bentley having gone back to England, asking that Matula be sent to Tumba to appear before the judge, expected in 3 or 4 days. In his letter, Mr. Graham also requested earnest prayer for Matula. His enemies had carefully prepared their accusations, while Matula, because of the nature of the charges, had no witnesses, only those who could testify to his gentle character. The commissioner said the case looked bad, and unless Matula could prove his innocence, he would certainly be hanged as a warning to others. Still, Matula went fearlessly to Tumba, confident in his innocence. Though he saw no path forward, he trusted God was with him. At Ngombe, we lifted him up daily in prayer, asking our wise and loving Father to defend the innocent, for we were convinced Matula was indeed innocent. When Matula arrived at Tumba, he was shocked to find some of his former accusers in chains. The government had learned about their attempt to murder him and had sent a sergeant and soldiers to arrest them. The troops arrived in Mongo just as the people were gathering for the burial of the chief's mother, who had remained unburied for months. Several pigs had been slaughtered for the occasion, and many cloths collected. The soldiers seized these and took the accused men to Tumba. Even in custody, they repeated the same accusation against Matula, claiming they had only tied him up to ensure his appearance in court. In truth, they were terrified, especially since Matula had warned them that punishment would come. The details of what followed in Tumba were best told by Meister Graham of San Salvador, who witnessed the trial firsthand. He explained that the delay in Matula's trial had been so long, it seemed the government had forgotten the case, likely due to illness and changes in judges. The arrest of Matula's would-be murderer may have revived interest in the matter. Soon afterward, Mr. Graham was notified that the trial would be held on December 9th. Matula was brought to Tumba on December 8th to await the hearing. But the judge failed to arrive. Again they were told the judge was coming, and again they brought Matula and his witnesses, but the judge was sick, and the case was postponed a second time on December 16th. On the following day, December 17th, Mr. Graham wrote to the judge, explaining that they had twice transported Matula and his witnesses only to return again, and asking who would be appointed as Matula's defense and when they should come back once more. On Sunday, December 19th, I received a wire from the judge stating that Monsieur L had been appointed Matula's defender and the trial would take place on Thursday. On Monday, I met with ML and explained the entire case to him. Then I reviewed the notes from the earlier trial and discovered that the translator had completely misrepresented the facts. After reading the supposed evidence presented to the judge, ML believed that, guilty or not, Matula would be hanged. I too feared that unless the Lord intervened, this would end in judicial murder. Needless to say, I slept little until the trial concluded. That same day, by what seemed divine providence, I found 2 witnesses who had been with Matula at another location during the time of the alleged murder. I almost forced them to stay and testify, in case the key witnesses failed to arrive, and it was well I did. Meanwhile, we interviewed every possible witness and sent for others. The most crucial of these was a woman who had cared for her sister. One of the 2 women Matula was accused of killing. Both had died of smallpox, and this had occurred years before the supposed attack. On Wednesday afternoon, the judge and the prosecuting attorney arrived from Matadi by train. Unfortunately, the most vital witnesses were delayed by a storm and didn't arrive until after the trial had ended the next day. Then came the morning on which Matula's fate was to be decided. By mid-morning, people had gathered outside the plain-looking grass building, marked with the grand title, Tumba Palais de Justice. Soon, the judge, prosecuting attorney, clerk, defense counsel, interpreter, prisoner, soldiers, witnesses, and Mr. Graham were seen arriving from different directions and filing into the courtroom. Mr. Graham brought up the rear, carefully scanning the area to see if any expected witnesses had arrived. Guards took their positions outside the door. The natives stood in silent awe at the solemn formality with which the judge and counsel took their seats and prepared for the day's proceedings. everything at the Tumba trial was carried out as far as possible with the formality and dignity of a European court, much like it would be in Brussels. The contrast with native justice was extreme. In traditional native courts, proceedings are typically held in the open air. The highest-ranking chief sits on the ground atop a leopard skin, sometimes draped in a cloth, holding a spear or having it nearby. Other chiefs sit squatting around him, all trying to look as important as possible. Such native trials often begin with offerings of malavu, palm wine, and heavy bribes, and cases are frequently postponed due to confusion, argument, and chaos between the parties involved. So imagine the awe of those used to that system when they entered a formal courtroom. State officials in dark robes and white collars, solemn-faced, questioning and cross-questioning. It's no wonder native witnesses quaked, stumbled, and gave confused answers, just as some had during Matula's earlier hearing. Returning to Mr. Graham's account, he explained that he attended the trial only as a visitor, though in practice he served as an informal legal advisor to Monsieur L., Matula's appointed defender. A major setback was the absence of key witnesses. However, witnesses from the opposing side also failed to appear, balancing things somewhat. Mr. Graham had emphasized several key points to Monsieur L. in Matula's defense. A woman from Matente, not Matembe, no such place exists, had been captured years earlier by Yalala, a friend of Matula's family, in revenge for Matente capturing his son. This woman, Kinsiona, was sold to Kuba of Kwilu and later died there of smallpox, along with another woman. The sister of one of the women had nursed them both to the end. This caregiver and others who knew the case were on their way to testify. This incident, including the capture and death of Kinsiona, clearly occurred long before late 1896, before the Congo Railway arrived and before the state's law extended over the area. Therefore, any actions involved were part of a native conflict and could not be judged under laws that had not yet been established. As for Matula, he was well known to Reverend W. H. Bentley and other missionaries, both before and after the supposed murder. All gave a strong testimony of his good character. Moreover, despite their knowledge of the region, none of the missionaries had heard any rumor or report of such a murder around the time in question. Matula firmly denied ever visiting Matente and denied ever killing anyone or striking any woman, as the charges claimed. The clearest evidence showed he had no part in the quarrel during which Kinsiona was captured by Yalala's group. At that time, Matula had been away trading in another area and only heard of the conflict upon his return. 2 witnesses confirmed this. A man who gave evidence against Matula under the name Welo, better known as Kwenkezi, was not Welo at all, but Masamba, either his son or slave, who falsely claimed to be Welo. The real Welo, afraid his lie would be exposed, did not appear at the trial. In contrast, Matula, though he could easily have avoided trial, chose to appear 3 separate times, each with great inconvenience to himself and his family. Moreover, Mafuku, Welo's nephew and heir, along with others, had recently attempted to murder Matula. Mafuku was now in prison on that charge. Clearly, it was not Matula, but his enemies who had broken the law and acted against the state. Matula's defense counsel took these facts and presented a powerful speech. He convinced both the judge and the prosecuting attorney so thoroughly that they chose to hear Matula's own testimony. Matula spoke with clarity, calm, and integrity. In his closing remarks, the judge stated that there had been much false testimony against the accused and rejoiced that the weight of evidence clearly supported Matula's innocence. He then dismissed the case and declared Matula free, with a clean record. Upon leaving the courtroom, Mr. Graham and the others met the delayed witnesses, too late to testify. The prosecuting attorney sternly rebuked Masamba and Diamoni, Welo's wife, and when his knowledge of the language failed, Mr. Graham took over. They both made sure the false witnesses understood the gravity of their actions, and they likely won't risk perjury again. When Matula reunited with his friends, who arrived in style as if they owned the street, he told them,
Yes, I am free, but no thanks to you. If I had trusted in you instead of God, I might have been hanged.
The trial for Mafuku and the others who had tried to kill Matula was brief. They had been imprisoned for months, and Matula did not want harsh punishment. After a stern warning and being bound over to keep the peace, they were released. Once everything was settled at Tumba, Matula wasted no time returning home. That day of his return to the station was unforgettable. As word spread, crowds rushed out to meet him. Guns were fired in celebration, and the people danced with joy. At the Thanksgiving service, emotion ran high. Tears of joy filled many eyes as everyone recognized that God had truly heard and answered prayer. Matula has often returned to his old town, sincerely wanting to show his relatives that he had truly forgiven them. His trials had shaped him into a man full of love and gentleness. He became known as a true gentleman, one of the most genuine and sincere men in all Congo. Mr. Pinnock once said of him, "He is the only one-eyed fellow I know in Congo," meaning he lived with a single focus, to glorify God in all things. Chapter 15. Days of Peace. In 1899, Matula was received into church fellowship. His life was above reproach, and his simple, unwavering faith in the Lord Jesus made it impossible to withhold communion from him. Because the African people are so impressionable, leaders must be cautious about publicly recognizing new disciples. But Matula had already passed through a long season of trial and suffering, and had remained faithful, even to the brink of death, for the sake of Christ. Not long after his baptism, his remaining wife, Kento, was also baptized after professing her faith in Christ. She had been a faithful support to him in all his hardships, and through it all, her faith had never wavered. She was his first wife, married in 1889 when she was about 16 years old. According to native custom, he had taken 2 other wives, but never felt deeply attached to them. One abandoned him during the persecution, the other died shortly after they arrived at Ngombe. She had been happy with Matula, for even by native standards he had always been a kind and considerate husband. Yet one cannot help feeling her passing was merciful, for the heart of a man always cleaves to his first love. For years they had passed through troubled waters, often close to despair. But now the Lord had brought them into a peaceful harbor. Every visitor to their home felt it, peace and quietness. Their neat houses, tidy fences, clean paths, and well-kept gardens all reflected a home where it was a joy to live. In the mornings, the sound of the pestle pounding dried cassava into flour, the clucking of hens, and the bleating of goats spoke of a rare industriousness worth noting in the Congo. And in the evening, in a culture where men often feel ashamed to even acknowledge their wives in public, this warm, contented couple could be seen walking together around Vianga, or entering the missionaries' house side by side. Wherever we met them, there was always a cheerful smile, a kind greeting, and a native courtesy that was a delight to witness. I often wondered if they had some noble blood in their veins, for their expressions and behavior were so unlike the average Congolese. In Lower Congo, there are indeed a number of natives with refined manners, graceful movements, and delicate features, making one wonder if they are descendants of a nobler lineage than most. But that, of course, remains speculation. Matula was richly blessed after coming to live among the believers at Ngombe. He and his wife attended school faithfully and soon learned to read and write quite well. Matula found great comfort in reading his Ekangu Diampa, Bible, and had the joy of seeing more than 12 members of his household received into church fellowship. 2 of his sisters married native evangelists and were blessed with children. One particular joy and weight of responsibility was their only surviving child, a bright 10-year-old girl. Matula also had a son, but it was this little girl who was their constant delight and concern. Above all, Matula rejoiced most in the great transformation that came over his home village of Mongo. In early 1899, Mr. Cameron visited the district and, to his surprise and joy, found the people asking for a teacher to show them the way to God. The old chief had died and was succeeded by a young man named Lunenga, who was eager to learn and follow God, just as the people of Makuta had done for years. Lunenga had not been present during Matula's persecution, but when he heard about it, he was deeply ashamed. From then on, he became one of Matula's truest friends. A capable and earnest teacher was sent to Mongo, and soon a prayer house was built and later expanded. Around 60 to 70 students attended regularly, and Lunenga himself, along with several others, was baptized. In 1900, Lunenga accompanied the missionary to a neighboring town where he had lived during Matula's time of suffering. Because of his earlier heartfelt appeals and strong witness for the truth, the people there were now eager to receive a teacher as well. A young man was left to teach them, and the people enthusiastically built a fine house of worship, which was soon filled for daily prayers. Nearly 70 students enrolled in the school, and many began to seek God earnestly. From both Mongo and this new town, Kinsende, there is hope that the spiritual fire will spread to many more towns. Fires kindled by the flames of persecution once directed at the innocent and faithful Matula. Chapter 16. Signs of Coming Trouble. In 1900, many were sick with chest and throat infections, and Matula was among them. One night, I was woken by an Nlemvo, who told me Matula was very ill and feared he might be dying. I quickly dressed and went to his home. The room was quiet when I arrived. Matula was breathing fast, and his face looked anxious and troubled. At first, I thought he was near death. As we stood watching, to our surprise, he began singing softly,
Follow, follow, I will follow Jesus.
Then, confused, he murmured,
Oh, kill me now with a gun. I want to be free. The angels are waiting for me.
It seemed he was reliving his past suffering. Later he awoke and gently told his wife, who hadn't slept in 2 nights, not to cry, but to try to rest.
Don't cry. If I die, I am going to heaven, and you will soon follow me.
Then turning to others nearby, he said,
If I go, your father will be gone, but don't weep for me. Stay here and continue your work. You young women only marry Christians and go where they go.
His words came slowly. He was very weak. His cough was severe, and at times he seemed like he would choke. I stayed at his bedside for 2 hours, giving him soothing medicine, but I truly didn't think he would recover. He remained in this condition for 2 or 3 days. We fought hard, and by God's grace he pulled through, though I always sensed he was disappointed, as he had wanted to go home to God. His recovery was slow, and took nearly 6 weeks. Even after that, he never regained his old strength, and I began to worry that he wouldn't be with us much longer. Some of those who came with him had returned to Mongo after the teacher left, while others were taken by the dreadful disease, sleeping sickness. Before Matula became ill, Manquenia, the boy he had first given to Mr. Bentley, died from it, and the 2 companions who had travelled with him on that unforgettable journey also became victims. His mother had died not long after his return from Tumba. These losses weighed heavily on him. Sleeping sickness is a terrible, heart-breaking disease. Thousands die from it every year in Congo. It is sweeping through the land at a frightening pace, and yet no one knows how to stop it. The illness has been studied in medical journals and in London hospitals, but no solution has been found. It is heartbreaking to hear of faithful Christian believers suddenly being struck down by it. The thought that Matula might now have it is too painful. Oh, that someone skilled and compassionate would hear the cry of these suffering people and come to help. Even if such a mission brought little fame, the reward would be immense. To discover the cause of these countless deaths and to stop this dreadful disease would be a work worthy of the brightest minds. But this must be studied among the victims themselves, where the disease is doing its damage. One Sunday, Matula came to me wrapped in an old blanket, looking weak and unlike himself. "What's wrong?" I asked.
I came to talk to you about myself,
he replied.
You white men are my friends. I want you to tell me honestly, do I have sleeping sickness? I've heard people talking. I think Christians shouldn't hide things. I'd rather know so I can prepare myself. I feel pain in my legs and I don't sleep well at night. I only half doze and dream. Last night, I had a dream, not something I heard or read, but I thought we're like trees in the forest. They grow up toward heaven. They may get trimmed, but they keep growing until someone cuts them down to plant something else. Then their roots wither and their branches are burned. We're like that. We grow and thrive, suffer for a while, then go on until God cuts down the ones who aren't useful to plant others.
He kept talking, and I thanked God for this one precious life transformed by the gospel.
I also dreamed of water,
He continued.
It flowed gently, sometimes loudly over rocks, saying, I cannot stay, I must go on. But as it passed, someone could drink and be refreshed. I think I'm like that, passing quickly. Maybe God used me like the water to bless someone. I'm not afraid to go into glory. But if I die, what will happen to my roots, my wife and children?
He became quiet, and I sensed he had more to say.
Now, when I go to school, the children laugh at me because I'm slow. I feel some pride rise in me against the teacher, Sue, who's just a boy. But I ask God to forgive me. I try hard, but sometimes I spend a whole hour on one sum. They think I don't want to learn, but it's not true. Sometimes the devil tells me not to go back, but I pray for strength and go because I know it pleases Jesus. Still, I feel weaker.
Poor Matula. The fear of sleeping sickness seemed to haunt him, which was itself a sign. I told him we couldn't be certain yet, but reminded him how God had cared for him before. Just as his enemies couldn't kill him, neither could this disease if it wasn't God's will. We would pray earnestly for him. I reminded him that God blesses the one who delights to do his will, like a tree planted by streams of water. Our bodies, though, are like grass or trees that are cut down.
Is that in the Bible?
He asked. I turned to 1 Peter and read the last verses of chapter 1. He asked to see it, so I read from verse 13 to the end. He was delighted by the truth that we were bought not with perishable things, but with the precious blood of Christ. I had to read the whole chapter to satisfy him. It was a revelation to him that his sufferings had been a test of faith allowed by God. He had thought it was only the devil's doing. His face lit up with joy as he realized God had been guiding him through it all. Like Job, he had suffered much, but the devil could not take his life. Matula now saw all his trials as small things in light of what he now knew of God's love, power, and goodness. It was a joyful morning. The gloom he brought with him disappeared, and he left beaming with peace. He returned to live quietly in his home, near his wife's, burdened by what we feared was an incurable and contagious illness. He was extremely careful not to infect his wife or children. At communion, it was touching to see him use his own glass for wine and ask his neighbor to place a piece of bread before him, afraid even to touch the plate and risk contaminating it. Simple, sincere-hearted Matula. There are sadly too few like him. Chapter 17. Matula's Last Days. After the earlier chapters were written, I was overjoyed to read that a medical commission had been sent to Uganda to investigate the cause of the dreadful sleep sickness. May God grant success to their work so that thousands of lives may be saved and brighter days come to Central Africa. To our deep sorrow, Matula became one of the victims of this terrible disease. Sleep sickness affects people differently. In those who are naturally slow and quiet, it dulls every sense like a strong sedative, leaving them dazed and half-conscious. In the active and lively, it fights hard to take over, like a strong man trying to overpower another. They resist and fight, but gradually, as the mind weakens, their efforts become wild and irrational. Fits of temper, bursts of madness, and unreasonable behavior in otherwise gentle people are almost always early signs of the disease, showing the mind's attempt to resist. These strong-willed patients usually take longer to be overcome, especially if they are well cared for in the early stages. The illness can seem to lie hidden for a time, then suddenly show itself through a storm of emotion or madness. This was how it happened with Matula. For many months we suspected he had the disease, though it remained hidden. His faithful wife, Kento, cared for him with love and gentleness, but many of his dear friends and family died, and others longed to return to their home at Mongo, now a place of peace. They left reluctantly, and Matula was left with only his wife, a sister, and 3 young children. This loneliness, combined with the effects of the illness on his mind, caused him to turn on his wife, accusing her of being the cause of his pain, and he began to beat her. Then he would break down, weeping, full of guilt and sorrow. Eventually he became too violent to be kept at home safely. Fearing for his wife's safety, we suggested restraining him. But as soon as he heard the word chain, he ran off without a word. Later, we learned he had returned to his old home, traveling day and night. Soon after, his wife and sister followed to care for him there. He lived only about 2 more months. During most of that time, he was not in his right mind. But in moments of clarity, it was clear his heart still trusted the one in whom he had believed for so many years. Kento herself shared the account of Matula's final days. News of his illness and episodes of madness had reached Mongo before he arrived. The people expected outbursts of rage, but at first Matula remained calm. He rejoiced in the daily gatherings for morning worship and the singing of praise to God in the very place where he had suffered so deeply. But when he noticed many staying away from prayers, he began visiting the nearby hamlets to bring them in, and in doing so, found himself beating some of them. Realizing his danger, he begged his friends to tie him up before he harmed anyone. With heavy hearts, they tied him loosely, but after he broke free, they had no choice but to secure him more firmly, his neck, hands, and feet bound. Why did God allow this to happen to Matula? It is a great mystery, one understood only by the light of Christian suffering. In his sane moments, Matula continued to teach about God's love and the importance of worship. Once, he told his sister he had seen Jesus coming for him with a host of angels. His body, once so strong, could no longer endure. He grew too weak to stand, and the end drew near. The cords were loosened, the stick removed, and he was laid gently down, surrounded by those who loved and honored him deeply. During his final days, he was only occasionally conscious. But in those moments, he would raise his hand toward heaven and say, "Tala, look." His eyes would shine, and he seemed to listen to something beyond the reach of others. Surely he saw the king in his glory, calling him home. On his last morning, a bright and beautiful day broke over the earth, and for Matula, it marked the beginning of the eternal day of peace. Though his end was a mystery, his life remained a powerful testimony. Even as these words were written, an elderly woman, about 60, told a messenger that it was Matula who had taught her to trust in the loving Savior. She had once found joy in spiritual things, but after losing her only daughter, she withdrew, convinced God did not love her. One day, Matula found her weeping and shared with her the story of the widow of Nayan in his own vivid way. He described how the grieving mother had cared for her only son, watching over him with deep love until the day he died. In her sorrow, she cried out, beat her head on the ground, and cut herself in grief. But then a man full of majesty and gentleness appeared. He told her not to weep, her son was only sleeping. He touched the casket, and at once her son lived again. Overwhelmed with joy, she received her boy back from the grave. This story, so tenderly and powerfully told by Matula, brought comfort and faith to that grieving woman. It was one of many ways he continued to bless others, even in his final days.
Then,
said Matula,
I cannot say your child will return, but Jesus remains as loving and kind as ever. He has taken your child and is keeping her safe for you. Don't cry. Trust him, and you will see your daughter again.
Since then, said the elderly convert, my tears have ceased. I've trusted the Savior and never doubted his love. Just a few weeks ago, Mr. Frame had the joy of baptizing her in her own village. As the sleep sickness began to turn into madness, Matula spoke at a church meeting, sensing his time was short. He urged the believers to care for the sick and suffering, especially those afflicted with sleep sickness, who were like those already under sentence of death. He encouraged them to serve these people with compassion, knowing that in doing so, they were serving Christ, who would reward them. But if they showed no mercy, how could they expect mercy themselves?
Hell
He said.
is not a place made just for bad people, but a place people prepare for themselves by their actions. With their evil deeds, they carry their own firewood to fuel their torment.
This vivid image, likely heard from a missionary, had taken root in his heart and stayed with him. You were a kind and Christ-like soul, Matula. On this earth we shall not see you again, but we will meet once more when the dawn breaks and the shadows vanish. Matula has entered heaven's eternal light. Surely the angels have already rejoiced over this precious soul, drawn out of the darkness of Congo's soil. For all the love, labor, sacrifice, and tears poured into the work in Congo, this one life redeemed by Christ's blood is a worthy return. And yet Matula was not alone. A noble one, yes, but just one among many. We thank God for the growing multitude from Congo joining the ranks of the redeemed, lifting their voices in the great anthem, "To him who loved us, to him who conquered, to him who holds power over death and darkness, glory forever. Amen." You have finished listening to A Miracle of Modern Missions, The Story of Matula, a Congo Convert. Audiobook produced by scrollreader.com. Listen to our audiobooks for free on our site, YouTube, or Spotify.